My sister moved back into our parents' home claiming she was sacrificing her youth to care for our aging mother. 10 months later, I found my childhood home listed on Zillow and a shoebox shoved in the back of a hallway closet containing 18 forged checks. $360,000 drained from my parents' retirement accounts in less than a year. When I confronted them with the evidence, my parents told me not to make it a police matter because she was family. I stayed perfectly calm. What they did not know was that I had already made a phone call. And when the knock finally came at the front door, my sister dropped her coffee cup in sheer terror. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who severely underestimated your worth. The air in my parents' Atlanta home was thick with the rich, familiar smell of Sunday dinner. Collard greens, candied yams, and roast beef sat untouched on the dining room table, surrounded by the clinking of crystal glasses and polite conversation. It looked exactly like the perfect picture of a successful, loving African-American family, deeply rooted in their community. I walked right past the dining table, ignoring the startled looks from my father Elias and my mother Brenda. I marched straight into the living room and slammed a stack of 18 forged checks and a freshly printed Zillow listing onto the glass coffee table. The sharp crack of paper and heavy cardboard hitting the glass echoed like a gunshot over the soft jazz playing from the stereo. "You listed Mom's house, Chantel?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet, completely devoid of the screaming or crying they always expected from me. "And you drained $360,000 in 10 months. My 38-year-old sister Chantel did not even flinch. She sat perched on the velvet sofa, casually adjusting her flawless silk press. She tapped her fresh acrylic nails against the sleeve of her designer cashmere sweater, a sweater undoubtedly bought with my mother's stolen retirement funds. "I moved in to care for her," Camille Chantel said, rolling her eyes as if I were a foolish child asking a stupid question. "Caregiving is a full-time job. I deserve compensation for my sacrifices." Compensation. I repeated, stepping closer to the coffee table so my shadow fell over her. "You have not cooked a single meal in this house since you moved in. You have not driven Mom to a single doctor appointment or picked up a single prescription. I know because I checked the pharmacy logs. What you have been doing is funneling Mom's life savings directly into Trent's failing business ventures." I pointed a rigid finger toward the dining room where Chantel's husband Trent was sitting. Trent was a white man who fancied himself a startup visionary, though his only real talent was burning through other people's money and leveraging my family's credit to do it. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but remained silent, letting my family do his fighting for him. My father, Elias, immediately stepped between Chantel and me, his chest puffed out, shielding his golden child, just as he had done for the past 35 years. "Lower your voice in my house, Camille," he ordered, his eyes blazing with that familiar, heavy disappointment he reserved only for me. "Your sister sacrificed her own life and freedom to move in here and help us. You are just bitter because you are 35, single, and married to your spreadsheets." The accusation hit exactly where he aimed it, trying to strike at my insecurities as an independent woman, but I refused to let the hurt show on my face. Brenda chimed in from her leather recliner in the corner, calmly adjusting her woven shawl as if we were discussing a minor disagreement over a grocery bill rather than grand larceny. "Do not make this a police thing, Camille," she said, waving her hand dismissively at the undeniable proof on the table. "She is family. The money is just an early inheritance. Trent's new business needs capital right now, and family helps family." I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, trying to comprehend the sheer terrifying scale of her delusion. They were literally watching Chantel steal the roof over their heads, yet I was being painted as the villain simply for bringing them the evidence. This was the toxic dynamic I had survived for 3 decades. I was the permanent scapegoat, the daughter expected to work twice as hard for half the recognition, always expected to clean up the golden child's catastrophic messes. "If you think letting her take your home is an early inheritance," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured and dangerously low, "then you are a fool. They will be out on the street and you will be left with nothing." Chantel stood up abruptly, pulling a folded legal document from her expensive designer handbag and shoving it toward my chest. I have full legal control of Brenda's estate, she sneered, waving the paper in my face with a triumphant glare. You have no authority here, Camille. Mom signed this power of attorney in front of a notary 2 weeks ago. I am in charge now. I looked at the document, then back at my sister's smug face, feeling a profound sense of disgust. A power of attorney, I said, shaking my head slowly. You convinced her to sign away her rights so you could fund Trent's delusion. It is funny how family helps family now. I remember being 19 begging you both to co-sign a modest student loan so I could finish my finance degree. You sat in this very room and told me I needed to learn independence. Yet that very same year you remortgaged this exact house to pay for Chantel's lavish destination wedding in the Bahamas. I had to work 3 jobs to pay for my own survival while you subsidized her luxury. Trent laughed aloud from the dining room, the sound sharp and grating. He walked over a crystal glass filled with my father's top-shelf bourbon, loosely gripped in his hand. Leave the finances to the men, Camille, Trent said, with an arrogant smirk that made my blood boil hot enough to scorch my veins. The house closes in 4 days. You cannot stop the wire transfer. You are just upset you did not think of cashing in first. I looked at Trent, then at Chantel, and finally at my parents who stood silently by the very people actively ruining them. I realized in that profound, crystal-clear moment that there was absolutely no reasoning with a family so deeply committed to their own destruction. They wanted to protect the golden child more than they wanted to protect their own survival. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or shed a single tear of frustration. I reached down and calmly picked up the shoebox full of forged checks. You are right, Dad, I said, flashing a cold, calculated smile that seemed to momentarily unnerve even Chantel. She is family. I will let it go. I turned on my heel and walked out the front door, leaving the suffocating atmosphere of that house behind me. As I walked down the driveway to my car, my mind shifted effortlessly from wounded daughter to the professional powerhouse I had become. They still saw me as the struggling college student they had refused to help. They had absolutely no idea that over the past decade, I had climbed the corporate ladder with relentless, undeniable determination. I was now a senior wealth manager at one of the top financial firms in Atlanta, handling 9-figure portfolios for clients who demanded absolute perfection. I dealt with sophisticated corporate fraud, complex asset protection, and high-level financial structuring before my morning coffee. My sister honestly thought she was pulling a fast one on a naive little girl. The moment I sat in the driver's seat of my car, I pulled out my phone. I opened my secure professional email application and found the draft I had prepared late last night. Attached to the email were 150 pages of encrypted financial documents, bank statements, wire routing histories, and clear, undeniable evidence of check forgery. The recipient was Harrison, a ruthless forensic accountant and federal investigator I frequently contracted with through my firm when dealing with high-level financial crimes. I hit send without a single second thought. I started the engine, watching my parents' front door in the rearview mirror as I backed out of the driveway. Trent and Chantel thought they had won the war of attrition they had been playing our entire lives. They thought I was powerless to stop the closing of the house. Let them think they won, I whispered to the empty car. The timer had just started and they had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. The silence in the living room was absolute. My father's insult hung in the air between us, heavy and toxic. He expected me to shatter. He expected the 35-year-old woman standing before him to revert to the teenager who used to beg for his validation. Instead, I simply stared back at him, entirely unblinking. I looked at his defensive posture, the way he positioned his body to physically shield Chantel from the consequences of her own actions. The sheer audacity of him calling me bitter while standing over the literal evidence of his own financial ruin was astounding. He was a proud man, a man who had worked his entire life in local government, always obsessed with projecting an image of the perfect, flawless family to our church congregation and our neighbors. Admitting his eldest daughter was a thief would destroy that image, so he chose to attack me instead. Before I could dissect his ridiculous claim, my mother decided to enter the fray. Brenda shifted in her plush leather recliner over in the corner of the room. She calmly adjusted the edges of her woven shawl, ironically, a piece I had purchased for her during a business trip to Milan last winter. Her face held that familiar placid expression she always deployed whenever she needed to sweep my sister's catastrophic failures under the nearest rug. "Do not make this a police thing, Kendra," my mother said, her voice smooth and entirely devoid of alarm. She waved a hand toward the forged checks on the coffee table, as if they were nothing more than misplaced mail. "She is your sister. She is family. We handle things internally. We do not invite the authorities into our home to ruin our reputation. That money is just an early inheritance. Trent's new business venture needs the capital right now, and family helps family." I felt a cold laugh rising in the back of my throat, but I clamped it down. An early inheritance. My mother was sitting there defending the unauthorized liquidation of her entire life savings, rebranding grand larceny as an act of familial charity. They were willing to sacrifice their own twilight years just to maintain the illusion that Chantel's marriage to a self-proclaimed tech visionary was a resounding success. "Family helps family," I repeated, ensuring my tone remained perfectly level. "Mom, she drained $360,000. That was your liquid safety net. That was the money for your physical therapy, your medication, your property taxes. What exactly is your plan when the accounts hit zero next month? Are you going to pay the utility bills with Trent's business proposals?" Chantel scoffed, tossing her perfectly styled silk press over her shoulder. She stepped out from behind my father, her confidence bolstered by their blind loyalty. She reached into her oversized designer handbag, rummaging for a moment, before pulling out a crisp, neatly folded legal document. She held it up like a shield, a smug, triumphant smile spreading across her flawlessly made-up face. "You do not need to worry about Mom's bills," Kendra, Chantel stated, tapping her manicured finger against the thick paper. "Because you have absolutely no authority here. I am the one managing their care. Mom signed this power of attorney in front of a notary just 2 weeks ago. I have full legal control of her estate. I am in charge now, and I decide where the funds are allocated." I looked at the document in her hand. A power of attorney. She had actually convinced our mother to sign away her legal rights under the guise of caregiving solely to expedite the draining of their assets. The blatant manipulation was sickening, but the fact that my parents had willingly signed it was what truly solidified my resolve. They had handed her the keys to their own destruction. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the satisfaction of the angry black woman stereotype they so desperately wanted to project onto me. I knew that the moment I showed emotion, they would use it to invalidate my facts. Instead, I channeled every ounce of my frustration into a surgical verbal strike. "It is fascinating how family helps. Family now," I said, looking directly into my mother's eyes. I remember a very different set of rules when it came to me. "Let us talk about your definition of financial assistance." I remember being 19 years old, sitting in this exact same living room. I begged you and Dad to simply co-sign a modest student loan so I could finish my finance degree. I did not ask for cash. I just asked for a signature. And you sat right there in that recliner and told me I needed to learn the value of independence. My father opened his mouth to interrupt, but I held up a hand, silencing him with a sharp glare. "I am speaking, Dad. You told me to be independent. Yet that very same year, you and Mom went to the bank and remortgaged this exact house to pay for Chantel's lavish destination wedding in the Bahamas. I had to work 3 jobs. I had to take on predatory high-interest loans that took me a decade to pay off. I financed my own survival while you subsidized her luxury. You have always expected me to be the responsible one, the permanent safety net, while you throw all your resources at a daughter who has never worked a full day in her life and a son-in-law who bleeds you dry." Chantel's face flushed a deep, angry red. "You are just jealous because Trent actually has ambition. He is building an empire, and you are just a corporate drone working for someone else. You do not understand how real wealth is created." Before I could dismantle her laughable defense of a man who had never held a successful job, Heavy footsteps echoed from the dining room. Trent stepped out of the shadows, walking with the exaggerated swagger of a man who believed he owned the world. He was holding a crystal tumbler filled to the brim with my father's most expensive top-shelf bourbon. He took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the amber liquid burn down his throat, before giving me a condescending smirk. Trent took another step forward, planting his feet firmly on the hardwood floor, as if he already held the deed to the property. He looked me up and down, clearly trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me. This was his standard tactic, projecting the unearned authority of a mediocre man who had married into an African-American family, expecting to drain their generational wealth without facing a single consequence. He honestly believed his superficial charm and aggressive posturing would force me to back down. "We are making moves that require serious capital," Trent continued, pointing his glass at me. "Real estate tech integration, the kind of things that go right over the head of a mid-level manager. Your sister and I are taking this family to the next level, so do yourself a favor and back off before you embarrass yourself. Leave the finances to the men, Kendra. The market waits for no one, and like I said, the house closes in 4 days. You cannot stop the wire transfer." I looked at Trent holding my father's bourbon glass like it was a trophy. I looked at Chantel standing there, with her chest puffed out, wrapped in designer cashmere, bought with stolen money. I looked at my mother, settling back into her recliner with a sigh of relief, and my father standing guard over the very people who were actively destroying his financial future. In that specific, agonizing moment, the heavy, suffocating fog that had clouded my judgment for 35 years finally lifted. I saw them, with absolute terrifying clarity. There was no reasoning with a family so deeply committed to their own delusion. They had constructed a reality where Chantel was the savior, and I was the bitter antagonist, and they were willing to sacrifice their home, their retirement, and their survival just to maintain that incredibly toxic fiction. If I raised my voice, I would simply be playing the role they had already assigned me. I would be the angry, irrational daughter causing a scene at Sunday dinner. If I begged them to look at the bank statements, I would just be the jealous sister trying to tear down a fragile marriage. They wanted a fight because a fight meant they could deflect from the actual crime sitting right there on the glass coffee table. I decided right then and there to stop playing their game entirely. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs as the anger completely drained out of my body. It was replaced by a cold, mechanical precision. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear of frustration. I simply reached down and gathered the 18 forged checks, placing them neatly back into the cardboard shoebox. I picked up the Zillow printout of my childhood home and slid it right underneath the box. Then I looked up and gave them a soft, calculated smile that I usually reserved for aggressive corporate negotiators who were about to lose everything. "You are absolutely right, Trent," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly even. "I should leave the finances to the men. And Mom, you are right too. She is family. We should handle this internally. I will let it all go." The shift in the room was instantaneous. The thick tension evaporated into thin air. My father's rigid posture relaxed, and he offered a curt nod of approval. My mother smiled softly, patting her woven shawl, as if her supreme wisdom had successfully guided the family through a minor storm. But it was Chantel whose reaction was the most telling. She smirked. It was a wide, triumphant smirk that practically vibrated with malicious satisfaction. She honestly thought she had won. She believed she had finally conquered me in the lifelong war of attrition she had been waging since we were children. She thought her little power of attorney document was an impenetrable shield that made her invincible. I turned around and walked out of the living room without another word. My heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor, echoing down the hallway. The rich smell of collard greens and roast beef faded as I opened the heavy wooden front door and stepped out into the humid Atlanta afternoon. I walked down the concrete driveway toward my car with my head held high, feeling the sun on my face. As I walked, I thought about the sheer irony of their absolute blindness. They truly believed I was just a bitter corporate drone pushing papers for a modest salary. They still saw me as that desperate 19-year-old girl begging for a loan signature. They had completely missed the entire decade where I built an absolute empire out of my own sheer willpower. They did not know about the nights I spent sleeping in the university library or the years I spent working entry-level analyst jobs where I was the only black woman on the entire trading floor. I had to be twice as smart, twice as fast, and completely flawless just to get a seat at the table. And I did not just get a seat, I bought the table. I was now a senior wealth manager handling 9-figure portfolios for international clients. My daily routine involved tracking complex offshore accounts, dismantling sophisticated corporate fraud, and restructuring massive assets to protect generational wealth. I regularly sat in boardrooms with federal regulators and top-tier legal teams analyzing financial crimes so intricate they took months to unravel. I dealt with ruthless corporate sharks for breakfast. And here was my sister thinking she was a criminal mastermind because she managed to forge a few personal checks and hide them in a dusty shoebox in a hallway closet. It was honestly an insult to my intelligence. She was playing checkers in the mud while I was controlling the entire global chessboard. I reached my car, a custom luxury sedan that I had purchased entirely in cash 2 years ago. I opened the door and slid into the plush leather driver's seat, closing the door and sealing myself inside the quiet, soundproof cabin. The silence wrapped around me. I did not rest my head on the steering wheel. I did not break down and cry over the family I had just officially lost. I had mourned them a long time ago. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my phone. I bypassed my standard apps and opened a highly secured encrypted professional communication portal. I pulled up the draft I had prepared late last night when I first discovered the discrepancies in my parents' accounts. The file attached to the draft was massive, containing exactly 150 pages of irrefutable verified financial evidence. It included high-resolution scans of every forged signature, detailed wire routing histories, showing funds moving from my parents' retirement accounts directly into Trent's failing business accounts, and the official real estate listing, proving intent to liquidate a major asset without proper cause. I had even included the flawed power of attorney document, highlighting the legal blind spots Chantel had completely missed. The recipient of this encrypted package was a man named Harrison. He was a federal forensic accountant and an independent investigator whom I frequently contracted when my firm uncovered massive corporate embezzlement. Harrison was a ghost in the financial world. He was ruthless, perfectly efficient, and absolutely despised people who committed elder abuse and wire fraud. He possessed the authority to freeze accounts across state lines and pull federal warrants before a criminal even realized they were being watched. I looked at the screen, reading the brief message I had attached to the files. It simply said, "I have a live one for you, Harrison. Grand larceny, elder financial abuse, and federal wire fraud. The closing on the stolen property is scheduled for Thursday. Freeze the board." I did not hesitate for a single second. I pressed the send button. The digital confirmation flashed across my screen, indicating the encrypted file had been successfully delivered to his secure server. I locked my phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror, adjusting my collar and taking one final look at the house where I grew up. Trent was right about one thing. The house was going to close in 4 days, and I absolutely could not stop the wire transfer. But they had no idea that I was already 5 steps ahead of them. The timer had officially started, and the trap was firmly set. 48 hours passed in a blur of encrypted communications and federal filings. My corner office on the 42nd floor of a downtown Atlanta high-rise was a fortress of glass, steel, and quiet authority. It was a space I earned through late nights' ruthless negotiation and an ironclad track record. The heavy mahogany door to my suite was supposed to be a barrier against the chaos of the outside world. Trent shattered that barrier at exactly 10 in the morning. My assistant, a highly capable young woman named Sarah, appeared in the doorway, looking flustered, her hand hovering over her security earpiece. "I am so sorry, Ms. Wilson." He refused to wait at reception and just pushed past security. Trent shoved his way past Sarah before she could even finish her sentence. He was sweating through a custom suit that somehow managed to look cheap on his slouching frame. His face was flushed with a mixture of morning day drinking and absolute panic. "It is fine, Sarah," I said, not taking my eyes off my brother-in-law. "Close the door behind him." The heavy door clicked shut, sealing us in the soundproof room. Trent did not waste a single second. He marched straight across the Persian rug and slammed both of his palms flat down on my immaculate glass desk. He leaned his entire body weight forward, looming over me, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me into submission. It was a pathetic, transparent tactic. I had faced down hostile takeover specialists and aggressive hedge fund managers who possessed 10 times his intellect and 100 times his power. A sweaty, desperate grifter playing startup CEO was not going to make my pulse rise a single beat. "You need to call off whatever the hell you are doing," Trent growled, his breath smelling faintly of stale coffee and gin. "I got an alert from our title company this morning. They said a flag was placed on the property transaction. You are trying to freeze the wire transfer, and I am telling you right now to back off." I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not lean back in my chair. I held my ground, staring directly into his bloodshot eyes. "I have no idea what you are talking about, Trent," I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly flat. "I told you on Sunday that I was leaving the finances to the men." "Do not play games with me, Camille," he snapped, his voice rising, bouncing off the glass walls. "You think you are so smart sitting up here in your little ivory tower? But you do not understand high-level entrepreneurship. You are just a glorified bean counter. You move other people's money around and collect a safe little paycheck. You have absolutely no idea what it takes to build a legacy." I raised a single eyebrow, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him shift his weight uncomfortably. "A legacy," I repeated softly. "Is that what we are calling grand larceny now?" "It is a bridge loan," Trent insisted, jabbing a finger toward my face. "Your mother authorized it. I am taking my tech company public next year. We are looking at a valuation of over $50 million. Once the IPO hits, I will pay Brenda back every single penny with interest. You are just trying to sabotage my business because you are too small-minded to see the big picture." He was standing in my office, a space built on verified wealth and concrete financial reality, trying to sell me the same vaporware pitch he used to con my foolish mother. It was truly insulting. "You do not even have a viable product, Trent." I stated the fact plainly. "You have a pitch deck you bought off a freelancer on the internet, and a rented co-working space you use to drink with other unemployed men." Trent's face turned an ugly shade of crimson. Realizing that his business posturing was having zero effect, he pivoted to the only other weapon he had. He decided to go personal. He stood up straight, adjusting his jacket, and let out a cruel, mocking laugh. "You know, Chantel warned me you would do something like this," he said, his tone dripping with fake pity. "She told me you have always been like this. Cold, calculating, completely incapable of letting anyone else be happy. It is no wonder Marcus walked out on you." The mention of my ex-fiancé hung in the air, a clumsy attempt to strike a nerve. Marcus and I had broken off our engagement 3 years ago. The family narrative, entirely constructed by Chantel and my mother, was that I drove him away because I was too obsessed with my career and too emasculating for a man to handle. They loved to weaponize my failed engagement against me, using it as proof that my professional success came at the cost of my basic womanhood. Trent leaned back over the desk, a nasty smirk twisting his features. "You just cannot stand looking at Chantel and me, can you? You cannot stand that she has a successful, loving marriage while you are sitting in this giant office completely alone. You drove Marcus away because you refused to support him, and now you are trying to ruin your sister's marriage out of pure, unadulterated jealousy. You want Chantel to be as miserable and lonely as you are." I did not break eye contact. I did not defend my past. Trent did not need to know that I ended my engagement to Marcus because I caught him trying to leverage my financial assets to pay off his hidden gambling debts. Trent did not need to know that I walked away from that relationship because I refused to let a mediocre man drag me down to his level. That was a lesson my sister Chantel fundamentally failed to learn, and now she was paying the ultimate price for her desperation to keep a husband. Instead of getting angry, I felt a deep, profound sense of calm wash over me. Trent had just played his final weakest card. He had marched into my territory, insulted my profession, insulted my personal life, and attempted to intimidate me into looking the other way while he robbed my parents blind. He was so busy trying to tear me down that he failed to notice the secondary monitor on my desk. I slowly spun my high-backed leather chair, pivoting just slightly so my body was angled toward the large monitor displaying a heavily encrypted, highly confidential financial dossier. It was the preliminary report Harrison had sent over at 6 o'clock this morning. I reached out and tapped the keyboard, waking the screen up, letting the harsh white light illuminate the dark mahogany of my desk. High-level entrepreneurship, I asked, letting a genuine razor-sharp laugh slip past my lips. I let the sound of my laughter bounce off the floor to ceiling windows of my office. It was not a warm sound. It was the sound of a predator realizing the prey had just walked directly into a steel trap. I gripped the edge of my secondary monitor and rotated it smoothly on its articulated arm until the glowing screen faced Trent directly. "Take a look at your empire, Trent," I said, pointing a manicured finger at the screen. "Because from where I am sitting, it looks remarkably like a burning building." Trent scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest, attempting to maintain that infuriating posture of unearned superiority. He glanced at the screen, expecting to see some generic corporate spreadsheet he could easily dismiss. Instead, his pale blue eyes locked onto a highly classified, federally aggregated financial profile, with his legal name stamped across the top in bold red lettering. "Let us talk about this high-level entrepreneurship of yours." I began leaning forward and resting my forearms on the pristine glass of my desk. "I pulled your corporate tax filings this morning, or rather I attempted to pull them. It turns out your groundbreaking tech startup has not filed a single tax return in 2 consecutive years. The IRS has already issued preliminary warnings to your registered business address, which hilariously enough is a mail drop box behind a strip mall in Buckhead." Trent swallowed hard. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered on his face just seconds ago began to fracture. He uncrossed his arms and planted his hands on his hips, trying to project a relaxed confidence that his rapidly paling skin completely betrayed. "That is an accounting error," he stammered, his voice losing its booming resonance. "My CPA is handling a restructuring. You do not understand how corporate tax deferments work." "I understand them perfectly," I replied, my voice dropping to a whisper that forced him to lean in to hear his own destruction. "Just like I understand the 3 active liens currently sitting on your personal and business accounts. You owe $45,000 to a commercial equipment leasing company. You owe $62,000 to a private logistics vendor who is actively suing you in state court. And my personal favorite, you have a staggering $80,000 federal tax lien hanging over your head like a guillotine." Trent took a physical step back. The polished startup visionary facade was dissolving right before my eyes, revealing the desperate cornered grifter underneath. The racial and social dynamics of our entire family history crystallized in this single moment. Trent had walked into our lives wearing his whiteness and his mediocre business jargon like a suit of armor. He had looked at my hard-working African-American parents, saw the generational wealth they had painstakingly built from the ground up, despite every systemic obstacle, and he treated them like a personal ATM. He assumed they would be too intimidated by his fast-talking tech buzzwords to ever question his financial maneuvers. He assumed Chantel would blindly follow his lead, which she did. And worst of all, he assumed I was just the quiet, bitter sister in the background who lacked the intelligence or the authority to ever challenge his position. He fundamentally underestimated the black woman sitting across from him, assuming my silence was submission when in reality my silence was simply observation. "Where did you get this information?" Trent demanded, a thin sheen of sweat breaking out across his forehead. "This is highly confidential. You hacked my accounts. I will have you arrested for corporate espionage." I smiled, shaking my head at his sheer ignorance. "You really are out of your depth. I am a licensed fiduciary handling 9-figure assets, Trent. I do not need to hack anything. When you routed those 18 forged checks from my mother's retirement account into a newly established LLC, you tripped a federal anti-money laundering algorithm. You used a regional bank that my firm actively contracts with for forensic auditing. You practically handed me the map to your own grave. Trent's breathing grew shallow and rapid. His chest heaved against his cheap suit jacket. The fight had completely drained out of him, replaced by the primal panic of a man realizing the floor had just vanished beneath his feet. "You brought up Marcus earlier," I said, my voice cutting through his heavy silence. "You thought that was a wound you could press. You thought I was sitting here mourning a failed relationship while you basked in the glory of your successful marriage to Chantel. What you do not realize is that I left Marcus for the exact same reason Chantel should have left you. I caught him trying to leverage my assets to cover a debt he was too cowardly to admit he had. I cut the dead weight. Chantel unfortunately married hers. And now you are dragging her down into a federal indictment with you." I tapped a key on my keyboard, bringing up a new window on the monitor. "Now let us talk about where that $360,000 actually went. You told my parents you needed capital to scale your business for a $50 million IPO. But this wire transfer history tells a very different story. You did not invest a single dime into software development or payroll." I watched his eyes dart toward the door, as if calculating the distance and his chances of running. "2 weeks ago, I continued, my tone relentless. You wired exactly $280,000 to an offshore holding account registered in the Cayman Islands. But that account is just a shell. The terminal destination of those funds traces directly back to a private lending institution in Las Vegas. A lending institution that is currently under federal investigation for predatory loan sharking and organized crime associations." Trent's mouth fell open. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. "Did you honestly think a wire transfer of that magnitude to a flagged offshore account would just slip by unnoticed? Did you think the federal banking system operates like a neighborhood piggy bank? The people you owe money to in Vegas do not care about your pitch decks or your fake valuations. They care about liquid cash, and you handed them stolen retirement funds. You crossed state lines. You used electronic communications to facilitate the theft. That is the very definition of federal wire fraud. You are not taking anything public, Trent. You are not building an empire. You took out a massive high-interest shadow loan in Vegas. You lost the money, and the people you borrowed it from threatened to break your legs. So you convinced my idiot sister to forge my mother's signature, steal her life savings, and launder the funds through your fake business to pay off a loan shark. You are not a tech visionary. You are a common thief laundering stolen elder funds." The absolute silence in the office was deafening. The only sound was the faint, rapid ticking of the antique clock on my wall and Trent's ragged, panicked breathing. He stared at the monitor, seeing his entire life, his freedom, and his marriage evaporating in lines of raw financial data. He realized in that agonizing stretch of seconds that he had committed crimes that carried decades in federal prison. His eyes darted frantically around the room, wild and cornered. He looked at the locked mahogany door, then back at the glowing screen, exposing his crimes, and finally at my desk phone sitting right next to my keyboard. The sheer terror in his mind completely short-circuited whatever rational thought he had left. In a blind, animalistic panic, Trent let out a guttural sound and lunged his entire body across my glass desk, his hands violently clawing toward the monitor and my phone. Trent lunged. Driven by pure, unadulterated terror, he threw his entire body weight across the wide expanse of my desk. He moved with a clumsy, heavy desperation, his arms outstretched, fingers curled into claws, aiming directly for the sleek secondary monitor and the multi-line secure phone sitting beside it. He wanted to smash the screen. He wanted to sever the connection. He wanted to physically destroy the digital reality of his own impending incarceration. I was already moving. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not scream. I simply planted my feet and rolled my high-backed leather chair smoothly backward, gliding across the thick Persian rug. I sidestepped his chaotic trajectory with effortless precision, moving entirely out of his reach. Trent's momentum carried him forward, his stomach slamming violently into the thick pane of the glass desk. The impact sent a shudder through the heavy mahogany frame, but the desk held firm. His hands scrambled frantically over the smooth, frictionless surface. He knocked over a silver pen, set the heavy metal clattering loudly, his fingernails scraping uselessly against the heavy base of the monitor. As he grunted, trying to drag his torso further across the desk to reach the cables, I calmly reached beneath the right lip of my desk. I found the small recessed panic button and pressed it twice. The silent alarm wired directly to the building's central security hub was instantly activated. Within exactly 6 seconds, the heavy double doors of my suite burst open. My firm did not employ standard minimum wage lobby guards. We handled billions of dollars in highly sensitive assets. We employed former private military contractors, men who moved with terrifying silence, carrying themselves with absolute lethal authority. Two massive men in perfectly tailored dark suits flooded into the room. They did not shout commands, they did not hesitate. They crossed the floor in rapid, synchronized strides, grabbed Trent by the shoulders of his cheap, sweat-stained suit jacket, and hauled him violently backward. Trent let out a startled yelp as his feet lost contact with the floor. He thrashed, kicking his legs wildly, his scuffed dress shoes dragging across my pristine rug. The guards pinned his arms behind his back effortlessly, locking his elbows into a physical hold that instantly neutralized his erratic thrashing. They forced him upright, holding him suspended just inches off the ground. The visual contrast in the room was almost poetic in its perfection. My office was a sanctuary of polished glass, rich mahogany, panoramic city views, and quiet, calculated power. It smelled of espresso and expensive leather. And right in the center of it was Trent, a wrinkled, red-faced, hyperventilating mess, sweating profusely, looking exactly like the cornered, desperate animal he truly was. His polished, startup visionary facade had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the pathetic reality of a failed grifter. "Hold him right there," I instructed, my voice crisp and authoritative. I stood up slowly, smoothing a microscopic wrinkle from the lapel of my tailored blazer. I walked around the edge of my desk, my heels clicking rhythmically, deliberately closing the distance until I was standing just inches away from him. Trent was panting heavily, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a mixture of impotent rage and absolute terror. "You really thought you could just barge into my territory and throw your weight around?" I said, keeping my tone conversational, almost disappointed. "You thought this was going to be exactly like walking into my parents' living room. You expected to raise your voice, puff out your chest, and intimidate the little sister into submission. But you forgot one crucial detail, Trent." I leaned in slightly, making sure he caught every single syllable. "You and Chantel rule that house because Brenda and Harold handed it to you. They subsidized your entire existence. They willingly remortgaged their shelter to fund your pathetic illusions of grandeur. But this room, this firm—" I gestured gracefully toward the sprawling Atlanta skyline behind me. "I built this entirely on my own merit. There are no handouts here. There are no sympathetic, enabling parents to hide behind. I earned every single inch of this space by outworking, outsmarting, and destroying men who are significantly more intelligent and far more dangerous than you." Trent glared at me, a vein pulsing erratically in his neck, but he could not move an inch. "Let us be very clear about what is happening here." I continued, stepping even closer, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. "You are a profoundly mediocre man. You married into a hard-working African-American family, took one look at the generational wealth my parents spent 40 years building, and you expected to drain it dry. You expected to walk in, throw around a few recycled tech buzzwords, and bleed them for everything they had while asserting your unearned authority over me. You severely underestimated who you were dealing with. You thought I was just a bitter, jealous sister. You failed to realize that I am the apex predator in the exact financial ecosystem you are trying to manipulate. You are completely out of your depth, Trent, and you are entirely out of my reach." I turned my gaze to the head of security. "Escort Mr. Davis out of the building. If he ever steps foot inside this lobby again, bypass me entirely and contact the Atlanta Police Department to have him arrested for trespassing. The guards yanked Trent upward, forcing him to march. He stumbled, his legs shaking violently as they propelled him toward the heavy suite doors. I followed them out of my office and into the vast open concept reception area. Sarah stood securely behind her marble desk, her posture perfect, her face completely impassive. Several junior analysts, wealth managers, and corporate attorneys paused in the hallway, clutching their tablets and files. They watched in stunned, deafening silence as this sweaty, desperate man was forcibly frog-marched through our pristine corporate corridors. Trent tried to dig his heels into the carpet, violently twisting his neck to look back at me. His face was a mottled purple, twisted with an agonizing humiliation. He was being completely and utterly dismantled in front of the very corporate elite he so desperately pretended to belong to. They dragged him into the expansive marble-lined elevator bay. One of the guards reached out and pressed the call button. The polished steel doors slid open instantly with a soft, melodic chime. They shoved him roughly inside the cab. Trent spun around, his chest heaving uncontrollably. He pointed a shaking, accusatory finger at me as he backed up against the mirrored wall of the elevator. "You think you won?" he screamed, his voice cracking, the desperate sound echoing loudly off the cold marble walls of the lobby. "You think you can just stop me? The house closes in 3 days, Kendra. 3 days, the paperwork is already signed. The title is clear. You cannot stop the wire transfer. You cannot save them." The heavy steel doors began to slide shut, slowly cutting off his frantic, screaming face. I stood alone in the quiet, absolute luxury of the elevator bay, the soft hum of the descending car vibrating beneath my feet. I let a slow, dark, and genuinely satisfied smile spread across my face. Trent was absolutely right. I could not stop the wire transfer from going through. I had no intention of stopping it. Because what Trent and his Vegas loan sharks did not know was that I had already spent the last 48 hours legally rewriting the escrow protocol. I could not stop the wire transfer because I was the one secretly controlling the receiving account. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp, clear blue sky that made the Atlanta skyline gleam like polished glass. I drove to the Buckhead offices of Sterling and Vance Title and Escrow with the quiet, absolute serenity of an executioner who had already sharpened the blade. The chaotic, sweaty desperation Trent had brought into my office 48 hours ago was entirely absent from my mind. I was operating on pure, cold, unadulterated focus. Harrison, my federal forensic accountant, had worked his magic through the back channels of the banking system. The board was set. The pieces were locked into place. All I had to do now was walk into the room and watch my sister willingly step directly into the trap she had built for herself. I handed my keys to the valet outside the towering glass and steel building and made my way to the executive suites on the 12th floor. Sterling and Vance was a high-end firm, the kind that catered to quiet wealth and massive commercial transfers. The reception area smelled of fresh lilies and expensive roasted coffee. I did not bother checking in with the front desk. I knew exactly which boardroom had been reserved for the Wilson estate closing. As I walked down the hushed, carpeted hallway, I spotted Boardroom B. The walls were floor-to-ceiling frosted glass, offering a blurred but unmistakable view of the scene unfolding inside. I paused for a single second just outside the door, observing the performance. Chantel was already there. Of course she was. She had likely arrived an hour early to establish dominance over the room and charm the closing agent before any actual paperwork was presented. She was sitting at the head of the massive polished mahogany table, looking like a carefully curated advertisement for generational wealth. She wore a tailored, cream-colored pantsuit that I knew for a fact cost more than my first semester of college tuition, purchased entirely with funds siphoned from our mother's depleted savings. Her silk press was flawless, cascading over her shoulders as she leaned forward, resting her elbows gracefully on the table. In one hand, she held an iced matcha latte, the green liquid swirling against the condensation on the plastic cup. Sitting across from her was Arthur Vance, a senior partner at the firm. He was an older, distinguished man in a charcoal suit, and he was currently completely captivated by my sister. Chantel was smiling brilliantly, flashing her perfect teeth, laughing lightly at something Arthur had just said. She was playing the role of the devoted, responsible daughter handling her aging parents' estate with absolute perfection. She was sweet-talking the man who held the keys to a $3 million wire transfer, ensuring he saw her as a peer rather than a predator. I reached out and pushed the heavy glass door open. The thick, soundproof seal broke with a soft hiss, and the low hum of the air conditioning rushed into the hallway. I stepped into the room, letting the heavy door click shut behind me. The light, melodic sound of Chantel's laughter died instantly in her throat. She froze, her perfectly manicured fingers tightening around her plastic cup. The mask of the charming, affluent socialite slipped from her face, revealing the vicious, panicked woman hiding just beneath the surface. She slammed her cup down onto the mahogany table, the ice rattling loudly in the quiet room. "What is she doing here?" Chantel demanded, her voice instantly losing its sweet southern cadence and jumping a full octave into a harsh, grating shriek. Arthur Vance blinked, startled by the sudden and violent shift in her demeanor. He looked up at me, taking in my dark, structured corporate blazer, my completely neutral expression, and the heavy leather briefcase gripped firmly in my right hand. He stood up slowly, smoothing his tie, clearly caught entirely off guard by the sudden hostility invading his pristine boardroom. "Excuse me," Arthur began, his tone cautious. "Are you a member of the Wilson family?" "She is a disgruntled sibling," Chantel interrupted, pushing her chair back and standing up so fast it nearly tipped over. She pointed an aggressive finger in my direction. "She has absolutely no legal standing here, Arthur. She is an estranged family member who has been harassing my husband and me all week. I want her removed from this building immediately. Call your building security right now. She is trying to hijack a private, highly confidential real estate transaction." I did not flinch. I did not defend myself against the accusation. I walked slowly and deliberately across the room, my heels sinking into the plush carpet, maintaining absolute eye contact with Arthur Vance. I reached the edge of the conference table and stopped projecting the exact same quiet, immovable authority I used in federal boardrooms. "Mr. Vance," I said, keeping my voice smooth, professional, and entirely devoid of the emotional hysteria my sister was currently displaying. "My name is Kendra Wilson. I am a senior wealth manager at Vanguard Financial, and I am the eldest daughter of Harold and Brenda Wilson, the legal owners of the property you are attempting to close on today." Arthur looked genuinely torn. He glanced from my immaculate, high-powered presentation to Chantel, who was currently vibrating with barely suppressed rage. As an experienced closing attorney, he could immediately read the profound difference in our temperaments. He was trained to spot risk, and my sister was suddenly radiating red flags. "Arthur, listen to me," Chantel snapped, stepping around the table to place herself physically between me and the closing documents stacked neatly on his desk. "She is incredibly bitter. She is just trying to create a scene because she cannot stand the fact that my parents put me in charge of their estate." Chantel turned her body slightly, making sure she was addressing Arthur, while ensuring her words were meant entirely to humiliate me. She let out a dry, condescending laugh, shaking her head, as if I were a pathetic, misguided child who had wandered into an adult conversation. "I know she looks very professional right now," Arthur Chantel continued, her voice dripping with venomous pity. "But you need to understand the family dynamic you are dealing with. She has always been a complete disaster when it comes to money. When we were younger, my parents literally had to drag themselves down to a used car lot and co-sign the loan for her beat-up, rusty little Honda because her credit score was an absolute joke. They had to hold her hand and guarantee her debt just so she could drive to her minimum wage job. They have never trusted her with anything of actual value. Meanwhile, they legally entrusted me with the deed to their $1 million home. They went to a notary, and they signed a power of attorney granting me total unencumbered control of their financial legacy because they know I am the only one capable of managing real wealth. She holds a childhood grudge. I hold the legal authority. Now I am asking you nicely, call security and have this woman escorted out so we can finish our business." She stood tall, breathing heavily, genuinely believing she had just delivered a fatal, humiliating blow. She honestly thought that bringing up a 15-year-old car loan would somehow invalidate my presence in a commercial boardroom. She thought she could shame me into turning around and walking out the door. I looked at my sister, taking in the sheer, staggering magnitude of her delusion. She was standing over a stack of fraudulent documents, actively attempting to finalize a federal wire fraud scheme to pay off a violent Vegas loan shark, and she was trying to lecture me about financial responsibility. It was a masterpiece of narcissistic projection. I did not respond to her insults. I did not address the pathetic story about my first car. I simply ignored her entirely, treating her like a mild, buzzing annoyance in the background of a much larger operation. I placed my briefcase on the polished mahogany table. The metallic latches snapped open with a sharp, heavy sound that echoed in the silent room. I reached inside and bypassed the standard legal folders. Instead, I pulled out a massive 3-inch thick leather-bound binder. It was the physical manifestation of the trap Harrison and I had built over the last 48 hours. It contained the frozen federal tracking numbers, the offshore routing blocks, the verified forgery reports, and the newly established ironclad escrow diversion mandates authorized by a federal judge at 7 o'clock this morning. I lifted the heavy binder and dropped it directly onto the center of Arthur Vance's desk. It hit the wood with a loud, resounding thud that made the ice in Chantel's discarded matcha latte rattle. I looked directly into my sister's wide, suddenly terrified eyes. I am not here to stop the sale, Chantel. I am here to update the disbursement instructions. Chantel stared at the massive leather-bound binder resting on the center of the polished mahogany table. For a fraction of a second, genuine doubt flickered behind her carefully mascaraed eyes. But decades of unchecked entitlement and blind arrogance quickly swallowed her hesitation. She let out a sharp, abrasive bark of laughter that echoed harshly against the frosted glass walls of the boardroom. "Are you actually insane?" Chantel demanded, her voice shrill and vibrating with an aggressive defensive energy. "You march in here with a prop from an office supply store and think you can dictate terms to me. I am the one running this transaction. I am the one with the legal authority." She snatched her expensive designer tote bag from the empty chair beside her, her hands moving with frantic, jerky motions. She dug past her makeup bag and her oversized sunglasses, pulling out a pristine, blue-trimmed legal folder. She slammed it down onto the wood right next to my binder. Flipping it open with a dramatic flourish, she jabbed her manicured index finger repeatedly at the top document. "Read it and weep. Kendra?" She sneered, her chest heaving as she tried to project absolute dominance. "This is a general durable power of attorney. It gives me absolute unencumbered control over every single financial asset, real estate holding, and bank account belonging to Brenda Wilson. It was drafted by a top-tier attorney. It was signed by our mother of her own free will, and look right there at the bottom. That is a certified state-registered notary seal. She signed it right in front of a witness. You have absolutely zero power here. You are just a pathetic, jealous spectator trying to ruin my life because you have nothing going on in your own." Arthur Vance shifted uncomfortably in his plush leather chair. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes darting toward the document Chantel was brandishing. As a senior closing agent, reviewing a power of attorney was standard operating procedure, but the sudden escalation of family hostility in his boardroom was clearly putting him on high alert. I did not immediately respond to her outburst. Silence is a weapon that people like Chantel simply do not know how to defend against. I let her harsh words hang in the cold, air-conditioned air, allowing the sheer desperation of her tone to resonate through the room. Turning my back to her, I walked unhurriedly over to the sleek mahogany credenza resting against the far wall. A crystal pitcher of iced water sat on a silver tray, alongside a row of spotless highball glasses. I picked up the pitcher, taking my time, and poured a glass of water. The sound of the liquid splashing into the crystal was the only noise in the room. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the icy water soothe my throat before I turned back to face the table. "You are absolutely right, Chantel," I said, my voice completely level and conversational. "I will not dispute a single word you just said. Mom did sign that document. She signed it exactly 3 weeks ago. And the notary seal is perfectly valid. I actually know the notary who stamped it. He is a very thorough professional. Chantel blinked visibly, thrown off balance by my immediate agreement. Her aggressive posture faltered for a second. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, eyeing me with deep suspicion. "Then what are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice dropping to a cautious, defensive register. "If you know my document is valid, grab your stupid binder and walk out that door before I have Arthur call the police." I walked back to the table and rested my fingertips lightly on the edge of the leather binder. I said, "Your document is valid." I continued, my gaze locking onto hers with absolute predatory focus. "I did not say it was relevant." Arthur Vance frowned, pulling his reading glasses from his breast pocket and slipping them onto his face. "Excuse me, Ms. Wilson," he said, addressing me carefully. "If your sister holds a valid, executed, durable power of attorney for the seller, she does possess the legal right to execute the closing documents and direct the disbursement of the sale proceeds. That is standard legal procedure." I turned my attention to the older man, offering him a polite professional nod. "It would be standard procedure, Mr. Vance, if Brenda Wilson actually owned the property we are sitting here discussing today. But she does not. And a power of attorney, no matter how beautifully notarized, only grants control over assets that the principal actually owns at the time of the transaction." Chantel let out another scoff, shaking her head in exaggerated disbelief. "You are losing your mind. Mom and Dad bought that house 30 years ago. Their names are on the deed. Dad passed away, which means Mom owns it free and clear. It is her house, which means it is under my control. You are literally just making things up because you are desperate." I unclasped the heavy metal rings of the binder and flipped it open. I bypassed the summary pages and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper secured with a blue legal backer. The county recording stamps were highly visible across the top margin of the first page. I slid the stack smoothly across the table until it rested directly in front of Arthur Vance. "Let us take a quick trip down memory lane, Chantel," I said, stepping away from the table and slowly pacing the length of the room. "Do you remember the spring of 2018? Chantel glared at me, her jaw clenched tight. "I have no idea what you are talking about, and I do not care. Let me refresh your memory," I offered, my tone turning dangerously sharp. "In the spring of 2018, you decided that you were suffering from severe corporate burnout after working a grueling 20 hours a week as a freelance social media consultant. You convinced Mom and Dad that you needed to go backpacking across Europe to find yourself. You spent 9 consecutive months bouncing between hostels in Barcelona and luxury villas in the Amalfi Coast, funding your entire journey of self-discovery exclusively through Dad's platinum credit card." Chantel's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. She opened her mouth to interrupt, but I raised my hand, silencing her with a look that dared her to speak. "While you were taking sunset selfies in Santorini and complaining about the Wi-Fi in Paris, Dad suffered his first massive heart attack. It was a widowmaker. He was in the cardiac intensive care unit for 11 days. Mom was completely paralyzed by fear, entirely incapable of making a single medical or financial decision. I was the one who sat in the waiting room every single night. I was the one who managed his care team. And I was the one who sat in the estate lawyer's office with him 3 days after he was discharged, because he was absolutely terrified of what would happen to Mom and their assets if he did not survive the next episode." The air in the boardroom grew incredibly heavy. Arthur Vance was completely silent, his eyes scanning the documents I had placed in front of him, his professional demeanor giving way to a profound, dawning realization. We sat in a room very much like this one. I continued, stopping my pacing and standing directly across from Chantel. He wanted to ensure that Mom would always have a roof over her head, but he was not blind, Chantel. He knew exactly who you were. He knew that the second he was gone, you would start circling the family assets like a vulture. He knew you would manipulate Mom into funding whatever fraudulent lifestyle you and Trent were currently chasing. So he removed the temptation entirely. I pointed to the documents resting under Arthur Vance's hands. On May 14, 2018, Dad established an irrevocable trust. He legally transferred the deed of the family home directly into that entity. The county recorded the transfer 3 days later. Brenda Wilson does not own that property. She simply holds a life estate allowing her to reside there. The trust owns the property. And because Dad knew exactly what you would try to do, he named one single solitary trustee with the absolute unchallengeable legal authority to manage, sell, or disperse the assets of that trust. Chantel was staring at me, her mouth slightly open, her breathing shallow and rapid. The aggressive, arrogant posture had completely vanished. She looked like a woman who had just stepped off a ledge and was waiting for the ground to rush up and meet her. "You are looking at the sole trustee, Chantel," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "Your power of attorney is a worthless piece of paper. It gives you control over Mom's personal checking account, but it gives you absolutely zero authority over the sale of this house. And it certainly gives you zero authority to wire $360,000 of trust assets to a shadow LLC set up by your criminal husband to pay off a gambling debt in Las Vegas." Chantel tried to speak. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her hand, which had been resting on the table, began to tremble violently. Her fingers twitched, brushing against the plastic cup of her iced matcha latte. The sudden jerky movement knocked the tall cup off balance. It tipped over. The plastic lid popped off upon impact with the table. A tidal wave of thick, green, milky liquid surged across the polished mahogany. It cascaded over the edge of the table and splashed directly downward, soaking the pristine white leather of Chantel's expensive designer boots. Green droplets splattered across the hem of her cream pantsuit. She did not even look down. She just stared at me, her eyes wide, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her defeat. Arthur Vance abruptly pushed his chair back, the wheels scraping loudly against the carpet. He had finished reviewing the first 3 pages of the trust document, his finger tracing the embossed county recording stamp that proved the deed transfer was legitimate and binding. The healthy, confident color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and physically shaken. He realized in that exact moment that he had been sitting in a room with a woman who was actively attempting to utilize his title company to facilitate a massive, highly illegal federal wire fraud scheme. If he had processed that closing and wired those funds based on her voided power of attorney, his career, his firm, and his own freedom would have been instantly vaporized by a federal indictment. He scooped up my binder and the trust documents, pulling them tightly against his chest as if they were a physical shield. "Do not process a single signature," Arthur said, his voice tight and breathless, speaking to the empty air as much as to me. "I need to call our legal department immediately. I need to halt the escrow protocol." He turned and practically sprinted toward the frosted glass doors, pulling them open and rushing out into the hallway, leaving the heavy doors to swing shut behind him. The heavy frosted glass doors swung shut behind Arthur Vance with a soft pneumatic hiss, sealing us inside the boardroom. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic dripping of the spilled matcha latte falling from the edge of the mahogany table onto the plush carpet. Chantel stared at the spreading green stain on her white leather boots. Her breathing was ragged and uneven. I could see the exact second the reality of her situation collided with her lifelong sense of untouchable privilege. Her mind simply could not process the fact that she had been outmaneuvered. For her entire life, she had operated under the assumption that if she screamed loud enough and threw a spectacular enough tantrum, the world would simply bend to her will. She snapped her head up and her eyes locked onto mine. They were wild, feral, and utterly devoid of the polished socialite persona she had spent years cultivating. With a guttural shriek, Chantel lunged across the space separating us. She did not throw a punch. She reverted to the exact same physical intimidation tactics she had used when we were teenagers fighting in the hallway of our parents' house. She grabbed the lapels of my dark, structured blazer with both hands, twisting the expensive wool fabric in her fists. Her heavy gold bracelets clinked wildly together as she yanked me forward, trying to physically shake the authority out of me. I did not stumble. I did not raise my hands to fight her off. I simply planted my feet into the thick carpet and let her expend her frantic, useless energy against my immovable stance. "You think you are so smart?" she screamed, her face inches from mine. A fine mist of spit flew from her lips as her voice tore through her throat. "You think you can just march in here with your fake legal binders and steal what is mine? I am calling Elias. I am calling Brenda right this second. I am going to tell them exactly what you are doing." I am going to tell them you are trying to hijack the family money because you are a bitter, jealous spinster who cannot stand to see me succeed. She shook my lapels again, her knuckles turning white from the strain. The scent of her expensive floral perfume was entirely overpowered by the sharp, acrid smell of her nervous sweat. "They are going to disown you, Kendra!" she yelled, her voice echoing painfully off the glass walls. "They are going to cut you out entirely. You are going to be nothing to this family when Elias hears what you did." I looked down at her hands gripping my jacket, and then slowly raised my gaze to meet her furious, terrified eyes. I did not blink. I did not elevate my voice by a single decibel. The contrast between her chaotic screaming and my absolute stillness was the true measure of power in the room. "You are relying on an outdated playbook, Chantel," I said, my voice smooth and chillingly calm. "You are operating under the delusion that we are standing in the family kitchen. You think that if you scream loud enough, Elias and Brenda will come rushing down the stairs to soothe your injured pride and force me to apologize. You think your tears carry weight here." I reached up and placed my hands over hers. I did not pry her fingers away. I simply gripped her wrists, applying a slow, steady, and agonizing pressure until the delicate bones in her hands ground together. She gasped, loosening her grip just enough for me to smoothly step back and brush the wrinkles from my blazer. "We are not in the family kitchen." I continued pacing slowly around her, forcing her to turn and face me. "We are in a commercial boardroom in the financial district of Atlanta. We are standing at the epicenter of the real world. And in the real world, your temper tantrums do not override federal trust law. You cannot cry your way out of a forged document. You cannot manipulate a judge by complaining that I am a jealous sister. The law does not care about your feelings, Chantel. It only cares about the paper trail." She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, trying to shield herself from the cold, hard reality I was forcing down her throat. "You are a thief," she spat, her voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. "You are trying to steal the proceeds of this sale to punish me. I am going to call Mom and Dad right now and tell them to halt the entire transaction. They will listen to me. They always listen to me." I stopped pacing and turned to face her fully. I let a slow, dark smile spread across my face. It was the smile of a chess player who had just announced checkmate 3 moves before the opponent even realized the game was over. "Call them," I whispered, leaning in close enough that she could feel the absolute certainty radiating from me. "Call Elias and Brenda right now. Put them on speakerphone. Tell them you want to cancel the sale." Chantel hesitated, her hand hovering nervously over her expensive designer handbag. Her eyes darted back and forth, searching my face for any sign of a bluff. She found none. "Do you want to know why I am actively encouraging you to call them?" I asked, taking another step forward, backing her directly into the edge of the conference table. "Because the buyer listed on that purchase agreement, the corporate entity that you have been communicating with for the last 30 days, is not some random real estate investment firm." Her eyes widened. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her pale and trembling. "The buyer for this house is a shell corporation I set up last week." I revealed, my voice dropping to a razor-sharp edge. "You did not secure a brilliant off-market deal with a wealthy developer, Chantel. You just sold Mom and Dad's house directly to me." She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her knees buckled slightly, and she had to grip the heavy wooden edge of the table to keep from collapsing onto the floor. I controlled the entire bidding process. I explained, laying out the mechanics of her destruction with methodical precision. I authorized the purchasing entity, using a registered agent to mask my identity. I provided the proof of funds. And because the property is legally owned by the irrevocable trust that I solely manage, the entire financial transfer is completely internal. You were so blinded by your own greed and desperation that you did absolutely zero due diligence on the buyer. You saw a high cash offer, and you immediately took the bait. You were relying on this closing to generate a $360,000 liquid payout. You desperately needed that cash to clear the offshore account and pay off Trent's incredibly dangerous associates in Las Vegas. You thought you could just walk in here, sign a few papers on behalf of Brenda, and walk out with a cashier's check to save your husband's kneecaps. I reached out and tapped a manicured fingernail against the heavy leather binder resting on the table. But that money is never touching your hands, I stated with absolute finality. The purchase funds are being routed directly from my corporate holdings into the primary trust account. An account that is federally protected, restricted by strict disbursement covenants, and entirely inaccessible to anyone without my direct cryptographic authorization. The money is locked in a trust you cannot touch. It is protected from your creditors, protected from Trent's loan sharks, and entirely protected from you. Chantel stared at me as if she were looking at a ghost. The reality of the trap had finally snapped shut around her. She had willingly, enthusiastically facilitated the transfer of the family's largest asset directly into a fortress I controlled. She had done all the legwork to lock herself out of the money she needed to survive. What am I supposed to do? She choked out a single tear, spilling over her lashes and cutting a dark track through her foundation. Trent owes them. They know where we live, Kendra. They are going to come after us. They do not care about trusts or shell companies. They want their money. You have two choices, I said, picking up my briefcase and preparing to leave the ruined woman behind me. You can walk out of this building, go back to your overpriced leased house, and figure out how to explain to your husband that you failed. Or you can call the federal authorities, confess to the attempted wire fraud and the forged power of attorney, and ask them for protective custody before the Vegas collectors realize the money is not coming. I turned and walked toward the frosted glass doors, not looking back as she began to sob uncontrollably into her hands. Either way, Chantel, the family bank is permanently closed. Chantel scrambled out of the boardroom like a rat fleeing a burning building. She did not bother to clean the thick green matcha dripping down her pristine white leather boots. She simply snatched her designer bag, practically tore the frosted glass door off its hinges, and ran. I remained in my chair watching her erratic departure through the glass. I did not need to chase her. Panic makes people incredibly predictable, and Chantel only had one move left to play. Trent's Vegas associates were not going to accept apologies, tears, or delays. They wanted liquid cash, and they wanted it immediately. With the house funds permanently locked inside my irrevocable trust, she had to pivot to the only other immediate capital available to her. She was going for the cash reserves. Specifically, she was going for Elias and Brenda's joint checking account at the First Capital branch on Peachtree Street. I knew exactly how much was sitting in that account this morning. $82,415. It was their operational cash meant for medical expenses, property taxes, and daily living. To Chantel, however, it was a lifeline. She had treated that specific joint account as her own personal ATM since she was 19 years old. It started with small offenses, a $2,000 charge for designer handbags she claimed were essential for a job interview she never attended. Then it escalated, a $10,000 withdrawal to cover a luxury vacation deposit with her sorority sisters. Elias had always enabled her. Whenever the balance dipped dangerously low, Elias would quietly liquidate minor stock positions and transfer the funds to cover her tracks, completely shielding her from any actual financial consequences, so Brenda would not panic. He absorbed the stress so Chantel could live in a fantasy world of endless capital. Because of his constant interference, Chantel had never heard the phrase insufficient funds in her entire life. She honestly believed the well would never run dry. She operated under the delusion that there would always be a fresh pile of money waiting for her to claim it. I checked my watch. The drive from Buckhead to the Peachtree branch would take her exactly 18 minutes in midday traffic. I picked up my leather binder, nodded to Arthur Vance, who was still looking slightly shell-shocked near the door, and took the private executive elevator down to the parking garage. I did not need to speed. I had already made a phone call. I arrived at the First Capital branch 12 minutes later. I bypassed the main teller line entirely and walked straight into the back suite, entering the spacious glass-enclosed office of Marcus Thorne, the senior branch manager. Marcus and I had crossed paths during several high-level corporate acquisitions over the years. He respected me, and more importantly, he respected the federal documentation I possessed. I took a seat in his comfortable leather visitor chair, crossed my legs, and watched the main lobby through the slats of the vertical blinds. Exactly 6 minutes later, Chantel's white Mercedes SUV jumped the curb outside, sliding erratically into a reserved parking space. She burst through the heavy glass double doors. Her hair was disheveled, her breathing was ragged. The polished, arrogant socialite who had sat in the title office just an hour ago was completely gone. She looked wild, unhinged, and absolutely desperate. She bypassed the standard customer queue and marched directly up to the priority teller station. She slammed her heavy handbag onto the marble counter, dug frantically inside, and slapped her driver's license alongside the same worthless general power of attorney she had tried to use at the title company. She leaned heavily over the counter, invading the personal space of the young teller. Then the performance began. Right on cue, Chantel's eyes welled with perfectly manufactured tears. Her voice took on a trembling, fragile quality. She began weaving a horrific, fabricated tale of family betrayal. She sobbed, telling the teller that her parents were currently in grave danger. She claimed that she was dealing with a financially abusive sister, Me, who was actively trying to hijack their accounts, steal their identities, and drain their retirement funds. She pressed a tissue to her eyes, playing the role of the devoted, terrified daughter, fighting desperately to protect her vulnerable parents from a monster. "I need you to close out the joint checking account immediately," Chantel demanded, her voice cracking with fake emotion. "All $82,000. I need it issued right now in a certified cashier's check made out directly to my LLC. It is the only way I can secure their money before my sister steals it. Please, you have to hurry before she accesses the network." The teller, a young woman whose name tag read Chloe, looked genuinely alarmed by the hysterical woman sobbing at her station. She picked up the power of attorney, examining the notary seal, and then began typing rapidly on her keyboard. Chantel tapped her fingernails frantically against the marble, constantly looking over her shoulder toward the bank entrance, terrified I might walk through the doors and interrupt her final desperate heist. But Chloe's fingers suddenly stopped moving. She stared at her monitor, her eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. A bright red notification had clearly overridden her system interface. She tried typing the clearance command again. The system rejected it, emitting a sharp negative beep. Chloe looked up at Chantel, her expression shifting from sympathetic to highly uncomfortable. She placed the power of attorney back on the marble counter and took a physical step back from her terminal. "I am so sorry, ma'am," Chloe said, her voice dropping to a cautious, nervous whisper. "There is a hard federal freeze on this account. I cannot process any withdrawals or transfers. I need to get the branch manager." Chantel's face twisted into an ugly, furious snarl. She opened her mouth to scream, to demand compliance, to throw the kind of massive, earth-shattering tantrum that had always terrified retail workers and our parents into absolute submission. But before she could utter a single sound, the heavy wooden door to the back office clicked open. Marcus Thorne stepped out into the lobby, adjusting his suit jacket, his face a mask of absolute professional severity. And I stepped out right behind him. I walked slowly across the polished floor, my heels clicking rhythmically in the sudden dead silence of the bank lobby. I stopped right next to Marcus, looking directly into my sister's horrified, completely shattered eyes. I beat her there. Chantel's jaw practically unhinged as she stared at me, standing shoulder to shoulder with the senior branch manager. Her hand remained frozen over her designer handbag, her meticulously manicured fingers trembling violently. The tearful, victimized daughter routine evaporated instantly, replaced by the raw, panicked realization of a cornered animal. I crossed my arms over my chest, planting my feet firmly onto the polished marble floor of the lobby. I did not raise my voice, but in the hushed, cavernous space of the bank, my words carried with absolute, devastating clarity. "You honestly believed you were the only person making phone calls this morning?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "You thought you could orchestrate a massive federal wire fraud scheme, drain our parents' retirement accounts, and nobody would think to pick up a phone?" Chantel sputtered, her eyes darting frantically between me and Marcus Thorne. "This is illegal!" she shrieked, pointing an aggressive finger at Marcus. "She has no authority over this account. My father set up this account. I have the power of attorney. You process my cashier's check right now, or I will sue this entire institution into the ground." Marcus did not even blink. He folded his hands neatly in front of him, projecting the absolute calm of a man who dealt with billions of dollars and had zero tolerance for lobby hysterics. The federal freeze on this account was not initiated by your sister, Ms. Wilson, he stated, his voice a rich, unwavering baritone. It was initiated at 6 o'clock this morning by the primary account holder. Your father, Elias Wilson, contacted our fraud department directly. He revoked your power of attorney and authorized a total lockdown on all liquid assets. The color completely drained from Chantel's face. She staggered backward a half step, the heels of her ruined matcha-stained boots scraping harshly against the marble. Dad would never do that, she gasped, shaking her head in frantic denial. Dad trusts me. He would never freeze me out. You are lying. She is paying you to lie to me. I uncrossed my arms and took a single deliberate step toward her. He did trust you, Chantel. He trusted you blindly for 32 years. He let you treat his checking account like your personal slush fund because he wanted to believe you were just irresponsible, not malicious. But Trent cured him of that delusion this morning. I watched her eyes widen in sheer terror at the mention of her husband's name. I kept my voice ruthlessly steady, delivering the facts like hammer blows. At 4 o'clock this morning, Trent backed a flatbed tow truck up to the climate-controlled garage on the family estate, I explained, watching her perfectly contoured face contort in horror. He bypassed the security keypad and tried to load Dad's pristine 1967 Shelby Cobra and the vintage Aston Martin onto the rig. He was going to sell them to a chop shop broker to get the cash for his Vegas debt. Chantel covered her mouth with her hand, a strangled gasp escaping her throat. But Dad could not sleep. I continued moving closer until I was mere feet away from her. He heard the diesel engine of the tow truck. He walked out in his bathrobe and caught your husband trying to steal his life's passion. Trent panicked. He shoved a 70-year-old man to the concrete to get away. Dad called the police and then he called me. He finally woke up to the absolute reality of who you married and what you have become. He knows everything, Chantel. He knows about the Vegas debt, the offshore shell accounts, and the forged documents. He authorized me to lock down every single dime to protect Brenda. You are completely cut off. For a long, terrible moment, the entire bank lobby was completely silent. The tellers behind the glass partitions had stopped typing. The few customers in the queue were staring openly. The realization that her safety net was permanently gone, that her father had finally turned against her, and that she was facing the imminent wrath of violent loan sharks shattered the final fragile remnants of Chantel's sanity. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She spun around to face Marcus Thorne, projecting all of her terror and rage onto the black executive standing calmly before her. "You listen to me!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet lobby like a siren. She slammed her fist down onto the marble counter, ignoring the young teller who recoiled in fear. "You work for us. My family deposits millions of dollars into this branch. You are nothing but an overpaid clerk. I demand you override that system right now and give me my money." Marcus remained utterly impassive. "Ms. Wilson, I am formally asking you to lower your voice and leave the premises. If you continue to disrupt our operations, I will have you removed." "I am not going anywhere until you do your job," she shrieked, her voice reaching a hysterical grating pitch. The deeply ingrained toxic entitlement she had harbored her entire life finally bubbled over into vile, unfiltered slurs. "You think because you wear a nice suit you can disrespect me. You are a glorified servant. You process my money, or I will make sure you are fetching coffee in a drive-thru by tomorrow morning. Give me my money." She lunged over the counter wildly, attempting to grab the teller's keyboard. Marcus signaled with a sharp, subtle nod. Instantly, two massive bank security guards in dark uniforms materialized from the edges of the lobby. They moved with swift professional efficiency, stepping in on either side of Chantel. One guard gripped her left arm, the other secured her right, pulling her back from the counter and restraining her frantic, flailing limbs. "Take your hands off me!" Chantel screeched, thrashing wildly against their grip. Her heavy designer handbag slipped from her shoulder, crashing to the floor and spilling lipsticks, credit cards, and loose change across the polished marble. "You cannot do this. I am Chantel Wilson. I own this town. Let me go." The guards did not say a word. They simply executed a flawless pivot, lifting her slightly off her feet and marching her forcefully toward the heavy glass exit doors. Chantel kicked out blindly, her green-stained white boots scuffing the floor, her flawless hair flying in absolute disarray. She screamed obscenities, threats, and desperate pleas, fighting like a feral animal as they dragged her through the vestibule and pushed her out into the humid Atlanta afternoon. The heavy glass doors swung shut instantly, silencing her hysterical screams. Through the glass, I watched her stumble onto the pavement, pointing furiously at the guards, before finally collapsing against the side of her Mercedes, burying her face in her hands. The silence inside the bank slowly returned, heavy and thick, with the aftermath of the spectacle. I bent down methodically, gathering the scattered contents of her spilled handbag, placing the items back into the expensive leather tote. I stood up and handed the bag to one of the security guards who had stepped back inside. "Please ensure she gets this," I said quietly. I turned back to Marcus Thorne. He smoothed his tie, his expression returning to its standard, unflappable calm. "I apologize for the disruption, Marcus," I said, offering a sincere professional nod. "My sister is currently experiencing a severe reality check." Marcus offered a faint, knowing smile. "In our line of work, Kendra, we see financial desperation take many forms, though I must admit that was certainly one of the more spectacular displays. The accounts will remain frozen indefinitely until Mr. Wilson directs otherwise." "Thank you," I replied. I turned and walked toward the exit, the plush carpet absorbing the sound of my footsteps. I stepped through the double doors into the parking lot. The intense southern heat immediately hit my skin. Chantel was nowhere to be seen, having apparently fled the scene in her SUV, leaving behind a faint streak of burnt rubber on the asphalt. I walked toward my own car, retrieving my keys from my blazer pocket. Just as my hand wrapped around the door handle, a sharp double vibration buzzed against my hip. I paused, pulling my phone from my pocket. The screen lit up with an incoming text message from an unsaved number, but I knew exactly who it was. The area code matched Trent's secondary burner phone. I unlocked the screen and read the message. "I have Chantel's laptop. I know where she hid the rest of the forged checks and the routing numbers for the offshore accounts. I will hand the entire physical drive over to you tonight. $50,000 in unmarked cash and full legal immunity from Elias." I stared at the glowing text, a cold, satisfied thrill washing over my senses. The rats were not just fleeing the sinking ship, they were actively cannibalizing each other to survive. I slid the phone back into my pocket without replying, got into my car, and started the engine. The board was completely cleared, and I held all the remaining pieces. The late afternoon sun beat down on the Atlanta asphalt, radiating waves of oppressive heat that mirrored the suffocating reality closing in on my family. I did not reply to Trent's text message immediately. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the agonizing lack of confirmation to fray his already failing nerves. I drove back to my office, secured the fraudulent title documents and the frozen account confirmations in my personal safe, and waited until the sky bruised into a dark, stormy violet before finally sending a single address to his burner phone. I chose a location that was the absolute antithesis of the pristine boardrooms, the polished marble bank lobbies, and the luxury boutiques where Chantel and Trent preferred to stage their lives. The Rusty Anchor was a windowless concrete block of a dive bar situated on the deep industrial outskirts of the city, wedged tightly between a tire recycling plant and an abandoned strip mall. It was a place where desperate men went to hide, making it the perfect setting for my brother-in-law. I pushed through the heavy metal door. The air inside was thick and stagnant, smelling intensely of spilled beer, fried grease, and decades of ingrained cigarette smoke. A few neon beer signs flickered violently against the back wall, casting a sickly artificial glow over the sticky linoleum floor. I spotted Trent immediately. He was tucked into a high-backed, cracked vinyl booth in the darkest corner of the room, positioned so he had a clear, unobstructed view of the entrance. The man who usually strutted through family holiday gatherings in custom-tailored suits and imported loafers now looked like a hunted animal. He was wearing a rumpled light blue dress shirt that was heavily stained with dark patches of nervous sweat around the collar and underarms. His hands were planted flat on the table, his fingers drumming a frantic, erratic rhythm against the chipped formica surface. His eyes were wide, heavily bloodshot and darting wildly around the room. I walked over to the booth, my heels sticking slightly to the floor with every step. I slid into the seat directly across from him. I did not say a word. I simply placed my hands on the table and waited. Trent swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his damp collar. He leaned forward, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial, desperate whisper. "You came." "Thank God," Kendra Trent breathed, wiping a trembling hand across his glistening forehead. "You have to believe me, this entire nightmare was her idea. Chantel is completely out of control." He attempted to force a look of shared camaraderie onto his haggard face, leaning closer across the table. "We are the only sane ones left, Kendra." He pleaded, his voice thick with fake sincerity. "You know exactly how she is. You know how Elias and Brenda raised her. They turned her into this monster who thinks the universe owes her a blank check. She demanded the lifestyle, Kendra. She had to have the country club memberships, the luxury cars, the designer clothes. If I did not provide it, she would threaten to leave me and humiliate me. I was just trying to keep my head above water. I am a victim of her greed just as much as Elias is." He paused, scanning my neutral expression, desperately trying to find a foothold. "I tried to stop her from targeting the house," he lied, his breath smelling of sour whiskey and panic. "I swear to you I told her it was a bridge too far. But she would not listen. She has a sickness when it comes to money. But I can give you everything you need to lock her away and get the family funds back. I know where she hid the offshore accounts. I have the routing numbers. I have digital copies of the forged checks she used to siphon your dad's business accounts before she moved on to the real estate. I have it all." I sat perfectly still, observing the staggering depth of his cowardice. It was a masterful, pathetic performance. He was relying on the old family dynamic, trying to position himself as a fellow outsider, a fellow victim of Chantel's insatiable appetite. He actually believed he could bond with me over my sister's toxicity. He thought I had forgotten the last decade of family dinners where he sat beside Chantel, sipping expensive scotch paid for by my father, laughing along with her cruel jokes about my boring corporate lifestyle. He had enthusiastically consumed the fruits of her manipulation for years, driving the luxury cars and living in the gated communities funded by Elias's quiet bailouts. Now that the bill had finally come due, he was desperately trying to sever the tether and watch his wife sink so he could float. "You are a very poor liar, Trent," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the bar like a scalpel. "You did not try to stop her. You actively managed the offshore transfers. You set up the Shadow LLC that was supposed to receive the wire from the title company today. You are not a victim. You are a parasite who finally ran out of a host." Trent's jaw tightened. A flash of genuine anger broke through his fearful facade, but he quickly suppressed it. He could not afford pride right now. His life literally depended on this transaction. He reached a trembling hand into his slacks pocket and pulled out a small brushed silver flash drive. He kept his hand firmly over it, resting it on the sticky table between us. "It is all on here," Trent whispered, his eyes darting frantically toward the door before settling back on my face. "Everything you need to prove she acted alone in the forgery and the wire fraud. Every single digital footprint she thought she erased. I will slide this across the table right now. All I need is the $50,000 in cash we agreed upon and a legally binding guarantee that Elias will not press charges against me for the LLC setup. You get to save your parents, you get to put Chantel exactly where she belongs, and I get to disappear before those guys from Vegas find me. It is a win for both of us." I looked at the silver drive trapped beneath his sweating palm. I reached out, maintaining absolute eye contact with him, and simply waited. Trent hesitated for an agonizing second, his survival instincts battling with his greed. Finally, the desperation won. He slowly lifted his hand, sliding the small piece of metal across the formica surface until it stopped an inch from my fingers. I picked up the flash drive. The metal was warm and damp from his palm. I unclasped my pristine leather purse, dropped the drive inside, and snapped the brass closure shut. The sharp click echoed loudly in the cramped booth. Trent let out a massive, shuddering breath, slumping back against the vinyl seat, as if a physical weight had been lifted from his chest. "Okay," he breathed, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Okay. Do you have the cash in the car? We need to do the exchange quickly. I have a flight booked out of Hartsfield-Jackson in 3 hours." I did not reach for my bag again. I did not make a move to stand up. Instead, I reached inside the interior pocket of my blazer. I felt the crisp, sharp edge of a folded piece of printer paper. I pulled it out, bringing it down to the table. I took my time smoothing out the crease with the pad of my thumb, ensuring the document lay perfectly flat against the sticky surface. I slid the single piece of printed paper across the table to him. Trent frowned, looking down at the document. It was a high-resolution screenshot of a verified email chain. The logo at the top belonged to a highly aggressive, notoriously violent lending firm operating out of the shadows of the Las Vegas Strip. The body of the email contained the finalized signed contractual terms for a $360,000 high-yield debt marker. I watched the exact moment Trent's eyes locked onto the bolded text in the center of the page. I watched the blood drain so completely from his face that his skin took on the waxy, translucent pallor of a corpse. His breathing stopped entirely. The email clearly displayed the primary guarantor of the loan. It detailed the collateral pledged against the debt. It was not Trent's name on the bottom line. He had known his own credit was completely radioactive, entirely insufficient to secure a loan of that magnitude from men who demanded blood for bad debts. So he had stolen an identity with an impeccable, flawless financial history to secure the cash. He had used my name. He had used my social security number. He had pledged my federal corporate salary and my personal assets as the absolute guarantor for his Vegas loan. Trent looked up at me, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it bordered on complete madness. His mouth opened and closed, but his vocal cords were entirely paralyzed. He had come here believing he was selling out his wife to save his own skin. He had completely failed to realize that the woman sitting across from him was the very person he had sold to the wolves. I take the flash drive and drop it into my purse. Then I slide a single piece of printed paper across the table to him. It's a screenshot of an email showing Trent used my name and social security number as the guarantor for his Vegas loan. Trent stared at the single sheet of printer paper resting on the sticky Formica table. The neon lights of the rusty anchor flickered above us, casting a sickly, pulsing red glow over his face as his eyes darted frantically across the bolded text. I watched his pupils dilate, tracking the lines of the email screenshot that proved he had used my name, my social security number, and my corporate credentials to secure a $360,000 loan from a syndicate of incredibly dangerous men. His breathing hitched, catching in his throat like a jagged piece of glass. The arrogant, condescending brother-in-law, who had spent the last decade mocking my career, was completely gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a man staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. He lifted a trembling hand, dragging it across his damp mouth, unable to articulate the sheer magnitude of the catastrophic mistake he had just realized he made. "You stole my identity," I stated, keeping my voice low and perfectly measured over the low hum of the bar's jukebox. "You needed a guarantor with an immaculate credit history and verifiable liquid assets to satisfy your Vegas creditors. You knew Chantel had destroyed your joint credit years ago, and you knew Elias would never sign a debt marker for a gambling syndicate. So you used the data you skimmed from my tax returns when I helped you and Chantel file 3 years ago. You committed identity theft to secure an illegal loan." Trent swallowed audibly. He looked up at me, his face glistening with a fresh, cold sweat. "Kendra, please," he rasped, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "I was going to pay it back. I swear to God, the house sale was supposed to clear the debt before they ever contacted you. You were never supposed to know. It was just a placeholder, a temporary security measure to keep them off my back until the wire transfer went through." "A placeholder," I repeated, leaning back against the cracked vinyl of the booth. "You committed federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft against a licensed senior wealth manager. My financial credentials are federally regulated, Trent. Did you honestly think a high-risk Vegas lending syndicate would not run a hard inquiry on a multi-$100,000 loan? Did you think the federal monitoring agencies that regulate my license would not immediately flag a sudden massive debt marker secured in a state I do not even reside in? Panic seized him completely. He leaned across the table, his hands clasped together in a posture of outright begging. The stench of cheap beer and sheer terror radiated from him. Kendra, listen to me, he pleaded, his words stumbling over each other in his rush to negotiate a surrender. You have the flash drive. You have everything you need to destroy Chantel and protect your parents. Just give me the 50,000. Please. Wire it to my alternate account right now. Let me walk out that door and disappear. If those Vegas guys find out the house sale fell through, they will kill me. I am a dead man. Just let me walk away and you will never see me again. I will disappear tonight. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no sympathy, not even anger. He was simply a mathematical error that I was currently correcting. Do you remember Thanksgiving 2 years ago, Trent? I asked, changing the subject with a jarring, deliberate calm. He blinked, thrown entirely off balance by the question. What, he stammered. Kendra, please, we do not have time for this. You and Chantel were standing in the kitchen, I continued, ignoring his panic entirely. You were drinking my father's expensive scotch, and you were telling the entire extended family about your brilliant visionary tech startup that was destined to change the world. You were bragging about being a disruptor. When Aunt Martha asked how my career at Vanguard Financial was going, you laughed. You actually rolled your eyes and told her that I was just a glorified bean counter. You said I lacked the vision to understand real wealth because I was too obsessed with rules and regulations. Trent swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit, calculating his chances of simply running. But he needed the money. He needed the payoff. He was trapped by his own greed. I was just joking, he whispered, his voice trembling, as he desperately tried to backtrack. You know how Chantel is. She always wanted me to put you down to make her look better. It was just stupid family banter. I did not mean anything by it. It was a profound underestimation, I corrected him, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the table. You relied on the old family dynamic. You and Chantel both operated under the assumption that because you were loud, aggressive, and manipulative, you held all the power. You thought the quiet, responsible sister was weak. You thought the glorified bean counter would not notice when you skimmed my data. You thought I would just sit back and let you cannibalize my parents out of some misplaced sense of familial duty. I picked up my purse and pulled the strap over my shoulder. But the problem with underestimating the bean counter, Trent, is that we always track the numbers, we always follow the paper trail, and we always balance the ledger. Please, Trent begged, a tear actually spilling from the corner of his bloodshot eye. Just write the check. Give me the 50,000 and let me go. I am begging you on my knees, Kendra. Just write the check. I looked at him with an expression of pure, frozen detachment. I did not bring a checkbook tonight, Trent, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, absolute whisper. But I did bring a friend. Trent froze. The desperate pleading died in his throat. He slowly turned his head, his eyes widening as he looked over his shoulder toward the front entrance of the dive bar. 2 men had just stepped through the heavy metal door. They stood in stark, jarring contrast to the regular patrons of the Rusty Anchor. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in dark, structured suits. Their expressions were completely neutral, their eyes scanning the dim, smoky room with practiced, tactical precision. They spotted our booth in the corner, and they began walking toward us with a synchronized, purposeful stride that instantly commanded the attention of everyone in the building. As they reached the edge of our table, the lead agent reached into the interior pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open, the dim neon light catching the bright gold shield pinned inside. Trenton Miller, the agent said, his voice carrying the immovable, crushing weight of federal authority. I am Special Agent Harrison with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of aggravated identity theft, federal wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Trent's mind shattered. The fight or flight instinct dormant under layers of country club privilege and unearned arrogance finally exploded into pure, unadulterated panic. He looked at the federal agents, he looked at me, and then he made the absolute worst decision of his entire life. He bolted. Trent shoved his body backward, sliding wildly out of the vinyl booth. He scrambled to his feet, his dress shoes slipping on the sticky, beer-soaked linoleum. He spun away from the agents, his eyes fixed desperately on the glowing red exit sign marking the back alley door. "Stop right there!" The second agent shouted, his voice cracking like a whip through the bar. Trent did not stop. He lunged forward, throwing his arms out to push past a group of startled patrons standing near the pool table. He was moving on pure, blind adrenaline, utterly desperate to escape the consequences closing in around him. But the real world does not accommodate the frantic escape plans of desperate men. As he sprinted past the wooden bar, his foot caught the heavy cast-iron base of an overturned bar stool. The impact violently arrested his forward momentum. His ankle twisted with a sickening crunch. Trent pitched forward, his arms flailing wildly as he lost his balance entirely. With a heavy, devastating thud, he crashed face first into the filthy concrete floor. The sound of his jaw connecting with the ground echoed sharply over the music. He let out a muffled, agonizing groan, rolling onto his side and clutching his face. Blood immediately began to pool at the corner of his mouth, staining the collar of his expensive sweat-soaked shirt. Before he could even attempt to push himself up, the two federal agents were on top of him. Agent Harrison pinned Trent's shoulders to the floor, driving his knee firmly into Trent's back, eliminating any further possibility of a struggle. The second agent grabbed Trent's wrists, pulling them forcefully behind his back. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting closed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I stood up slowly from the booth, smoothing the front of my blazer. I walked over to where Trent was currently pinned to the sticky floor. He was breathing heavily, whimpering in pain, as the agents secured the cuffs and began hauling him up to his feet. His nose was bleeding, his suit was ruined, and the terrified, arrogant man who had spent a decade manipulating my family was finally facing the absolute end of his grift. Trent looked up at me, his eyes filled with a helpless, pathetic defeat. I looked down at him, my expression entirely unreadable. I reached into my purse, ensuring the silver flash drive was secure alongside the Vegas loan documents. I had everything I needed to lock him away for a decade, and everything I needed to completely dismantle my sister's fraudulent empire. I gave him one final dismissing nod, turned on my heel, and walked out of the bar, stepping back into the humid Atlanta night. I left the industrial outskirts of the city behind, gladly trading the flashing neon and stale cigarette smoke of the dive bar for the manicured tree-lined streets of my parents' upscale neighborhood in Buckhead. The drive gave me exactly enough time to let the remaining adrenaline recede into a cold, diamond-hard focus. Trent was currently sitting in a federal holding cell, completely stripped of his tailored suits, his burner phones, and his borrowed arrogance. He was facing a decade in federal prison. Chantel, however, was still comfortably wrapped in the delusion of her own untouchable status. The sprawling brick estate looked exactly as it always did on a Sunday evening. Warm light spilled from the massive bay windows, casting a golden, welcoming glow over the perfectly trimmed hedges and the immaculate lawn. I parked my car in the circular driveway, pulling in right behind Chantel's white Mercedes SUV. She had clearly driven straight here after her spectacular screaming meltdown at the bank. I did not bother ringing the doorbell. I turned the heavy brass knob and pushed the mahogany front door open, stepping onto the polished hardwood of the foyer. The deeply familiar scent of roasted garlic, rosemary, and slow-cooked beef floated through the hallway. It was the smell of Brenda's signature Sunday pot roast. The absolute audacity of that smell struck me like a physical weight. My sister had attempted to steal their entire liquid retirement fund just a few hours ago, yet my mother was still roasting meat and setting the formal dining table as if this were just another minor family squabble to be smoothed over with gravy, mashed potatoes, and forced smiles. I walked quietly across the entryway. Chantel's voice drifted out from the formal dining room. She was putting on a masterclass performance. I paused in the shadows of the hallway, listening as her voice trembled with perfectly calibrated, fragile distress. She has always hated me, Dad, Chantel was saying, her tone dripping with manufactured heartbreak and breathless sobs. She has always been horribly jealous of me and Trent. I just went to the bank to check on the accounts because Trent was worried about some irregular charges that popped up over the weekend. Kendra was already there colluding with that horrible branch manager to lock me out of everything. She screamed at me in the middle of the lobby. She is trying to financially ruin us because she is miserable and alone, and she wants me to be miserable too. I heard Elias sigh, the heavy authoritative sound of a patriarch who was deeply inconvenienced by his children's drama, but ready to lay down the law. We will sort it out tomorrow morning, Chantel. Elias boomed, his voice carrying absolute misplaced certainty. I will call Marcus Thorne personally and demand an immediate explanation. Kendra overstepped her bounds entirely. She had no right to embarrass you in public like that, and she certainly has no right to freeze your access. We are going to have a family healing dinner tonight, and we are going to fix this nonsense. I will not have my daughters fighting like common street brawlers over a simple misunderstanding. I stepped out of the shadows and into the wide archway of the dining room. The long mahogany table was set with the good china, the heavy silver flatware, and the crystal water goblets. Elias sat at the head of the table nursing a glass of expensive red wine. Brenda was hovering nervously near the sideboard, holding a woven basket of warm rolls. Chantel sat to Elias's right, wrapped tightly in a plush cashmere shawl. She looked like a traumatized refugee rather than an aspiring felon who had just tried to wire $82,000 to a shell company. She was just lifting a delicate ceramic mug of coffee to her lips. She froze the second she saw me standing in the archway. The coffee mug stopped an inch from her mouth. Her eyes widened, darting frantically to the space behind me, as if she expected bank security guards to march into the house and drag her out of her chair. Brenda gasped, nearly dropping the basket of rolls onto the Persian rug. Kendra, she said, pressing a hand to the pearls at her throat. We did not think you were coming. I told your father you were probably too upset to join us after the terrible scene you caused this afternoon. I am not upset in the slightest, Mom, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. I stepped fully into the room, ignoring Elias and Brenda, entirely letting my eyes lock onto my sister. I am actually having a remarkably productive evening. Elias slammed his wine glass down onto the table. The crystal rang sharply against the polished wood. You have a lot of nerve walking in here with that sarcastic attitude, Kendra, Elias demanded, standing up from his chair to use his physical size to intimidate me. Your sister came here in tears. You humiliated her at the bank. You completely overstepped the temporary authority I gave you this morning. I told you to secure the accounts against Trent's gambling associates, not to launch a personal vendetta against your own flesh and blood. You will lift that freeze immediately. Brenda hurried over to Elias, placing a placating, trembling hand on his shoulder, before turning to me with a pleading, desperate look. Please, Kendra. Brenda begged, her voice taking on that familiar whining quality she used whenever she wanted to avoid reality. Let us just sit down like civilized adults. I made a pot roast. You need to pull out a chair, apologize to your sister for the misunderstanding, and we can all move past this. We are a family. We do not behave this way. We sweep our problems away and we move past this. Move past this. The phrase hit me with the force of a physical blow, echoing backward across 15 years of toxic family history. It was the exact same combination of words Brenda had weaponized against me when we were teenagers. I was 17 years old, working double weekend shifts at a retail clothing store to pay for a used beat-up Honda Civic. It was my only ticket to independence. One Friday night, Chantel had stolen my keys from my nightstand while I was asleep. She took the car to a senior graduation party, got incredibly intoxicated, and wrapped my only mode of transportation around a concrete telephone pole. She left the totaled smoking car in a ditch, called our parents, crying hysterically, and told the police that I had voluntarily given her the keys because I was too drunk to drive. I had been asleep in my own bed the entire night. I had never touched a drop of alcohol. But Elias and Brenda did not want to deal with a messy police investigation, and they absolutely refused to let their golden child face a license suspension or a criminal charge. Brenda had looked at me crying in the kitchen over my completely ruined car and my shattered independence, and told me to just take the blame so we could move past this. I was forced to take the fault. A week later, Elias bought Chantel a brand new BMW to help her recover from the emotional trauma of the accident. They had been sweeping her destruction under the rug for her entire life. They expected me to simply lift the rug and hand them the broom so they could do it again with a federal wire fraud scheme. They thought a stolen car and a stolen retirement fund could be handled with the exact same serving of pot roast and denial. I will not be apologizing to anyone, I stated, my feet planted firmly on the hardwood floor. And we will absolutely not be moving past anything tonight. The time for sweeping things under the rug expired the moment Chantel tried to steal $82,000 from your medical reserves. Chantel slammed her coffee mug onto the table. Dark liquid sloshed violently over the rim, staining the pristine white tablecloth. "You are a monster!" Chantel screamed, pointing a manicured, trembling finger at my face. "You are trying to destroy my marriage. Trent is out there right now working himself to the bone to secure our financial future, and you are trying to freeze our assets out of pure bitter spite. You cannot stand that he loves me. You cannot stand that we are successful and that you are just a miserable, jealous accountant." I watched her spin her desperate, vicious web, absolutely fascinated by the depth of her delusion. She actually believed Trent was out securing their future. She believed he was meeting his offshore contacts to finalize the transfer of the stolen funds. She had no idea that her devoted, loving husband had just sold her out for a silver flash drive and a false promise of immunity. She had no idea he was currently sitting in the back of a federal vehicle with his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, nursing a broken nose and a busted ankle. "I said sit down, Kendra," Elias commanded, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He pointed firmly at the empty chair across from Chantel. "I am the head of this family. I am telling you to sit down, apologize to your sister for the scene you caused today, and hand over the documentation you took from my safe. Trent is going to handle the investments and the estate planning moving forward. You are completely out of line." I looked at the three of them, the enabler, the dictator, and the parasite. I felt absolutely no obligation to any of them. The heavy, oppressive silence of the dining room pressed in around us, waiting for my compliance. They expected me to fold. They expected the dutiful daughter to sit down, eat the pot roast, and let them destroy themselves. I stand in the dining room and say, "I'm not here for dinner, Chantel." Before Elias can yell at me, three heavy, authoritative knocks echo from the front door. Elias paused, his face flushing with a sudden, indignant rage at the interruption. He threw his linen napkin onto his half-eaten plate of pot roast and marched heavily toward the foyer. I remained perfectly still, watching the archway. Chantel shifted in her seat, clutching her ceramic coffee mug, her eyes darting nervously toward the hall. Brenda wrung her hands, a low murmur of anxiety escaping her lips. The heavy oak front door swung open. Elias prepared to unleash a torrent of arrogant bluster, but the words died instantly in his throat. Harrison, the lead forensic accountant I had retained to trace the missing funds, stepped smoothly over the threshold. He did not look like a man apologizing for interrupting dinner. He looked like a man delivering an execution. Flanking him, their boots thudding heavily against the polished hardwood floor, were three fully uniformed police officers. Their utility belts clattered in the quiet house, a harsh metallic sound that shattered the pristine country club illusion my parents had cultivated for decades. Harrison walked straight into the dining room archway, the officer stepping in right behind him. He held a thick stack of manila folders and legally bound warrants in his right hand. Chantel's face went entirely slack. The blood drained from her cheeks so fast she looked momentarily translucent. The delicate porcelain mug slipped from her trembling, manicured fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, violent crash. The mug shattered into dozens of jagged white shards. Boiling hot, dark coffee splattered across the expensive wood and seeped rapidly into the fringes of Brenda's prized Persian rug. Chantel Wilson Harrison announced, his voice devoid of any emotion. "We are serving multiple federal and state warrants for your immediate arrest. The charges include felony elder abuse, grand larceny, and federal wire fraud." The dining room descended into absolute suffocating chaos. Chantel let out a piercing, guttural scream. She pushed her heavy dining chair backward, the wooden legs scraping horribly against the floor. She scrambled away from the table, backing herself into the corner of the room near the china cabinet, holding her hands up as if she could physically push the charges away. "Dad, do something," she shrieked, her voice tearing at the seams. "Mom, tell them to get out. They cannot do this to me. I have not done anything wrong. Kendra is setting me up." The three officers moved into the room with practiced tactical precision. They did not care about her designer shawl or the expensive address. They bypassed Elias, who was standing frozen in the archway, his mouth hanging open in complete, uncomprehending shock. Brenda finally snapped out of her paralysis. She lunged forward, grabbing Elias by the arm, shaking him frantically before realizing he was utterly useless in the face of federal law enforcement. She spun around, her wild, tear-filled eyes locking directly onto me. She knew I had the federal clearance, the high-powered attorneys, and the financial leverage. She knew I was the only person in the room with the actual power to stop a moving train. "Kendra, please," Brenda sobbed, tears ruining her perfectly applied makeup. She reached her hands out toward me, her voice breaking into a hysterical, desperate plea. "You have to stop them. Use your lawyers. Use your influence. Tell them it is a mistake. She is your sister. Please, Kendra, do not let them take her." I looked down at the floor. The dark coffee was still spreading across the rug, soaking into the intricate, expensive woven patterns, ruining it permanently. I looked back up, meeting my parents dead in the eyes. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I only felt the cold, undeniable weight of absolute justice. "Do not make this a police thing, Mom," I said, my voice echoing the exact callous cadence she had used against me 15 years ago. "She is family. We will just sweep it under the rug and move past this." I turned my back on them. I walked smoothly out of the dining room, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood. Behind me, Chantel's hysterical screams reached a fever pitch. I heard the scuffle of heavy boots, the firm commands of the officers taking control of the room, and the sharp, beautiful metallic click of steel handcuffs locking securely around my sister's wrists. I did not look back once as I walked out the front door and into the humid night. 3 weeks later, the silence in my corner office was absolute. I sat behind my sleek glass-top desk, reviewing the final legal briefing sent over by Harrison. The fallout from the dive bar had been catastrophic for my sister. Trent had completely cracked under federal pressure. Desperate to avoid a maximum sentence for his illegal Vegas loans and wire fraud, he had handed the authorities the silver flash drive without hesitation. That drive was a digital treasure trove. It contained every forged signature, every routed IP address, and every offshore account number Chantel had utilized over the past 4 years. Because of the overwhelming flight risk and the sheer volume of stolen capital, the judge had flatly denied Chantel bail. The untouchable socialite who had demanded luxury her entire life was currently sitting in a county holding facility wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, awaiting a federal trial that would inevitably end in a lengthy prison sentence. The intercom on my desk buzzed softly. My assistant announced that my 2 o'clock appointment had arrived. "Send them in," I instructed, closing the legal file and folding my hands neatly on top of the desk. The heavy mahogany doors opened. Elias and Brenda walked into my office. The transformation was staggering. They looked as though they had aged a decade in the span of 21 days. The arrogant, booming patriarch who had dictated the terms of our family from the head of a formal dining table was gone. Elias's shoulders were slumped, his expensive suit hanging slightly loose on his frame. Brenda looked incredibly fragile, her eyes downcast, her hands gripping the strap of her purse with white-knuckled tension. The federal freeze had done its job. The authorities had seized the remaining compromised assets to untangle Chantel's web, leaving my parents practically destitute. The country club memberships were revoked. The luxury cars were gone. They were drowning in legal fees and unpaid property taxes. They stood awkwardly in front of my desk. I did not offer them a seat. Kendra, Elias began, his voice lacking any of its former thunder. It was a raspy, defeated sound. We did not know where else to go. The lawyers took the last of the operational cash. The bank is moving to foreclose on the estate by the end of the month. We have absolutely nothing left. We came to ask if you could process a loan. Just enough to keep the house until we can figure out a way to liquidate some of the older assets. We will sign whatever paperwork you need. I looked at the man who had enabled my sister's toxicity for my entire life, and the woman who had constantly demanded I set myself on fire to keep her favorite child warm. You do not need a loan, Elias. I stated, my voice clinical and detached. Brenda looked up, a spark of desperate hope igniting in her tired eyes. You will help us, she asked, her voice trembling. I already have, I replied, leaning back in my leather executive chair. Yesterday afternoon, my legal team contacted your primary mortgage lender. I purchased the estate in full, entirely in cash through my irrevocable trust. The foreclosure proceedings have been canceled. The house is completely paid off. Elias let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. He reached out to take Brenda's hand. Thank God, he whispered. Kendra, I do not know how to thank you. We will pay you back every cent. You saved our home. I did not save your home, I corrected him, my tone dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. I bought an investment property. The deed is entirely in my name. You no longer own the estate. You are my tenants. The relief on their faces vanished, replaced by a stunned, humiliating realization of their new reality. You will continue to live in the house, I explained, laying out the terms with absolute, unyielding authority. My trust will cover the property taxes, the utility bills, and a monthly stipend for your groceries and basic living expenses. You will not lose your shelter, and you will not starve. But you will never hold the deed to that property again. You will never leverage it, you will never borrow against it, and you will never again have the power to blindly fund destruction. Brenda began to cry quietly, the tears tracking through the fine lines around her eyes. Elias stared at the floor, his pride completely shattered, accepting the terms, because he had absolutely no other choice to survive. There is exactly one condition to this arrangement, I added, standing up from my chair and walking around to the front of the desk. I leaned against the glass, looking down at the two people who had spent a lifetime making me the villain of their story. If you ever speak her name in my presence again, I said, every syllable carved from ice. If you ever ask me to fund a lawyer for her, if you ever ask me to contribute to her commissary, or if you ever attempt to move her back into that house when she is eventually released, the arrangement ends immediately. I will evict you, and I will sell the property to a commercial developer the very next morning. Do you understand the terms? Elias slowly raised his head. The fight was completely gone from his eyes. Yes, Kendra, he whispered hoarsely. We understand. Good, I said, gesturing toward the heavy wooden doors. My assistant will email you the tenancy agreements by 5 o'clock. You can see yourselves out. They turned and walked out of the office, their footsteps slow and heavy, the door clicking shut behind them, sealing them out of my world. I turned away from the door and walked slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that made up the entire back wall of my office. The sprawling, vibrant Atlanta skyline stretched out endlessly before me, gleaming under the bright mid-afternoon sun. I picked up a crystal glass from my side table and took a slow, deliberate sip of sparkling water. The ice clinked softly against the rim, the sound sharp and clear in the quiet room. The scapegoat is dead. The matriarch has arrived. True power doesn't come from being the loudest in the room or hiding behind a facade of family loyalty. It comes from quiet resilience, setting unbreakable boundaries, and recognizing your own worth when those closest to you refuse to see it. Sometimes the most profound act of self-care is refusing to set yourself on fire to keep toxic family members warm. You are never obligated to save people from the consequences of their own actions. Share your own story of drawing a hard line with toxic relatives in the comments below, and please subscribe for more empowering journeys of reclaiming your peace.